All right. Well, while we wait for Counselor Walker, we'll kind of get introductions started. The nice thing about Counselor Walker is she's so active both on our council as well as with parks that I think she probably is pretty familiar with the most of the people that are on here. I just want to start by thanking everybody for your community service, both our counselors as well as all of you who've decided and stepped up and serve on our parks committee. I have come over in quick fashion. I was just at our transit committee meeting just before this. I don't know if I'm supposed to let people know or not, but I kind of have a big mouth. I would say it's hard not almost to get emotional about it, but we achieved a long goal of ours to be able to get connections into Clackamas County from our Sandy Transit and SAM, which is really exciting, and I think will help out a lot of our community members with their daily lives. So that's the kind of work we're able to do here at the city, is stuff that impacts people every day. And I just want to thank all of you for your participation and efforts to do that. So I'm the loud mouth, the guy that talks all the time. Hopefully this is about the end of that, and then we really get into the meat of this. But I'm Mayor Stan Pulliam, and we'll go through and kind of have everybody introduce themselves. Jeff, I think you're the host, so you're in my upper left. But why don't we start with you, Jeff, and then we'll have everybody go through and do a quick introduction, maybe name, years you've been on role, and kind of the years you've been serving on either the council body or on parks.
Well, I'm Jeff Aprati. I've been with the city about 3 years. I'm the Director of Policy and Community Relations, which is a lot of things. One of those is city recorder. So happy to be here. Thank you, Mayor. I'll hand it off to whoever's next.
Rochelle, you're next for me, or okay. I don't know.
Well, I was just gonna suggest, Mayor, maybe you call on people as you
I've just kind of thought maybe I might have to do that. So Rochelle, you're up.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm the Park and Recreation Director. I've been with the city for a little over a year, and it's been a wonderful year. I can't believe how fast it's gone. And so thank you for the time tonight. And I'm just really excited to have this conversation with the Parks and Trails Advisory Board and the council. Yeah, this is important for our department. So thank you for making the time. I appreciate it.
Jamie.
Hi, I'm Jamie Sabak. I'm representing the firm 110%, and we have the privilege of working alongside Rochelle and John and the entire Park and Recreation staff. And I'll be sharing some really important content with you here shortly.
Wonderful, welcome, thank you. Kimberly.
I'm Kim. I have been on the Parks and Trails Advisory Board for just under a year now.
Thank you, welcome. Jordan.
Hi there, I'm Jordan Wheeler, City Manager since January 2019, so about 4 years now. Actually, I want to take this opportunity to point out a feature that you may notice in the Zoom webinar. Mayor, I forgot to mention this to you earlier today, but since it's there and enabled, just want to point it out, the chat feature that could come in handy during this work session. One thing to note about it is if you do use the chat feature, since this is a public meeting, be sure to do the drop down where it says to and select everyone, so that folks that may not be a panelist as part of this work session can also see that, and we can capture that as part of the meeting record. But that is something that maybe folks want to be able to use during the workshop. And if Jamie's doing a presentation, you may have a question you want to pop to the rest of the group. Just be sure to use the drop down for everyone. So thanks.
Helpful tip to everyone that I learned during COVID is that the meeting host can actually print off all the conversations that happen in the chat, including private messages. So just remember that for all your future meetings. Very important to know. Chelsea.
Hi, everyone. I am the Executive Assistant for the Parks and Recreation Department. I'm glad to be here with you guys tonight. I have been with the department for about 8 months now.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us. Ryan.
Ryan Altman. This is my first year with the Parks Board. And yeah, pleasure to be here. It's awesome to serve.
Thanks for being here. John.
Hi, everyone. I'm John Wallace. I've been working with the city for 8 months as well. I am serving as the Recreation and Senior Services Manager side of the Parks and Rec Department.
Welcome, John. Thank you. I'm sorry, Peck. And please let me know how to say your name so that I don't screw it up the rest of the evening on you.
No problem. I actually changed it. So my real name's Upekala. My full name is Upekala, but Peck is my nickname. So yeah, I have been on the Parks Board for almost a year, I think. I think it was January last year that I joined. So yeah, it's been really great and nice to meet all of you finally. I think I've met you, Mayor, at the longest day Parkway. You served me ice cream.
All right, good. Hopefully I didn't eat too much between that. Thanks for joining us. Lori.
Lori Smallwood, City Council. I'm also the Parks Board Liaison, and I'm super excited actually for the rest of council to go through this meeting because it's got some just really cool stuff in it. So I think everybody's going to really enjoy it.
Awesome. Carl.
Yeah, Carl Exner. I started with the city in 1911 when it was first incorporated. And in fact, I've been around so long that my son and the mayor went to high school together. And I have buried a couple of different skeletons that I'll be informing you all about the mayor here in the future. So, looking forward to talking about parks today.
Wonderful. Welcome, Carl. Thank you for staying mom on the skeletons. Will.
Be careful here now. I'll let him out.
Yeah.
Will Toogood, Greater Metro Sandy resident since 2001. Moved into town 3 years ago and joined the Parks Board shortly thereafter. So
gotta be quiet.
Happy to be here.
Right. Thank you. Rich.
Yeah, Rich Sheldon, one of the city councilors. It's my first term and I'm about halfway through. Looking forward to this.
Almost to your second term, Rich. You're not almost through, almost to your second term. Don.
Don Hokinson on city council and the same situation, a couple of years in now.
Thank you. Tiana. I'm sorry if I butchered your name. Tell me if I did. I'm so sorry.
No, Mayor, you have it correct. Thank you. I'm Tiana Rundell. I've been with the city for almost 3 years and I've been serving as the Parks and Facilities Manager since June. Excited to be here with you tonight. Thank you.
Welcome. Kathleen.
Good evening, everybody. Sorry I'm late. I thought I didn't see that it was a Zoom thing, so I was down at City Hall looking for it and had to drive home. So I was on the Parks Board since its inception in '97 and got off of the Parks Board when I was elected on the City Council a few years ago, 2 years ago or so.
Welcome. Glad you were able to join us. David.
How's everybody? This is my first term of being on the Parks Board, and it's been very interesting learning on how everything works and meeting a lot of different people. And sorry, yes, Milo, come on up, bud. And just learning a lot of new things. I'd say I was born and raised out here, but we moved away for a little while. Not a choice of my own. And then I came back to raise my kids here. So I've been here now for 14 years and that's where I plan to stay.
All right. Welcome, David. Thank you for joining us. Chris. Mayton.
Good evening, everyone. Chris Mayton, council-elect, so I haven't actually taken my seat yet. I've been a Sandy resident since 2005. I've also been on a planning commissioner for the last almost 5 years, and happy to be here tonight as a listener.
Yeah, thanks for joining. All right. Did I miss anybody? The squares move around a little bit on me. Just want to make sure I didn't miss anybody before we get going. All right, cool. Rochelle, do you want to kind of kick us off and I'll have you be the host this evening.
All right, happy to.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again so much for this opportunity to bring this work to the Parks Board and the Council for a joint work session. And I just want to set the context just a little bit on why we're here tonight. So in response to Council Goal number 5, which is to maintain financial strength and sustainability and look at cost recovery where possible, the Park and Recreation Department in August of 2022 embarked on the work to become more financially sustainable. So as part of this work, we hired a consultant to lead our department through this very important work, which is cost recovery and then an analysis of our budget. So this work encompasses many phases, and each of the phase builds on the next one or the one previous. And they include things like staff education, current budget analysis, and then eventually policy input. So at the end of the work, our Park and Recreation Department will have cost recovery goals that will clearly define how and where we're going to spend taxpayer money. This work is going to shed light on our expense management and areas for creative revenue opportunities. The intent is for the department to have a cost recovery model and policy, wow, combining those two words, that supports fiscal responsibility, and it will help with our decisions both short-term and long-term. So I have the pleasure tonight to introduce Jamie Sabak, who is the person at the helm of this great work. And Jamie is the founder, president, and principal of 110%. Jamie is considered a nationally recognized expert in the field of financial sustainability for parks and recreation. And she's with us tonight to provide an interactive learning session, followed by the important step of having council and the Parks Board weigh in on what will eventually influence our department's cost recovery policy. And so with that, I will gladly hand it off to Jamie.
Rochelle, thank you. And my appreciation to all of you for spending some time with me this evening as I walk you through an overview of the process, a review of the methodology we're using alongside the department, and obviously facilitating an exercise this evening to gather your feedback, perspectives, and input relative to helping influence the financial sustainability strategy for the organization. I'm going to share my screen in a moment, but I'd like to just add a few other additional comments before we actually get started. I've had the privilege of serving the park and recreation profession for over 30 years. I was a 20-year practicing professional, so at times I will admit it's hard for me to put my consultant hat on. I was a sports coordinator turned director of recreation, ultimately turned superintendent for the city of Boulder, Colorado. In the last 13 years, I've served the profession as an advisor, consultant, and in higher education. What I'm going to be sharing with you this evening is a methodology that's being used across the United States, as well as in some provinces in Canada. It's been evaluated for effectiveness by Penn State University, as well as Texas A&M. And we're really proud of the fact that there are many organizations across the country that are gravitating towards this work today. Some, unfortunately, out of desperation, largely because of economic turmoil. Others, like Sandy, simply because they feel like it's the right thing to do and it's the responsible thing to do at this moment in time. I also just want to share very briefly what a privilege it is to work with Rochelle and John and Chelsea and Tiana and the entire group. They've been incredible professionals to work alongside. Very passionate about, obviously, the profession, but really also passionate about doing the right thing for the community. So I wanted to just set the stage with those comments to begin. I'm going to share a slide deck with you. You'll notice throughout the presentation, there aren't very many text boxes in this, but the visuals really do complement the messaging that I'm going to share with you this evening. And the final thing I'll share before I jump into the agenda and the content is that I always find it incredibly valuable to have a board, a representative advisory board, as well as a policy-making body like a council work together in this exercise. So again, my great appreciation to all of you for spending some time with me this evening to better understand what is this work, and I would argue more importantly, why it's so incredibly important to the park and recreation profession, and of course, in this case, specifically to Sandy, Oregon. Our agenda looks rather ambitious, but we will get through this in the allotted time. Very simply, I'm going to share with you why this work is important to the industry today, and I would suggest even more so to local governments. I'm going to hit pause a couple of times throughout this evening to just check in with all of you to see if you have any thoughts, comments, questions that you'd like to share. Then I'm going to move into a section on the what and the how, and that's very simply sharing the methodology that we use working alongside park and rec professionals and systems across the country and helping them design and develop a financial sustainability strategy that makes sense for their organizations and their communities. Again, I'll hit pause at that point. And then I would say that of greatest value this evening is having an opportunity to hear from you and gather your thoughts, perspectives, and opinions around an exercise we refer to as beneficiary of service. And that term and that phrase will make a little bit more sense as obviously I walk you through the content tonight. Again, I'll hit pause for thoughts, comments, and questions, and then I'll share next steps before we wrap up, before I pass it back to Rochelle. So this is just a quick review of what our agenda will include this evening. So I want to start here with a little context. I've had the privilege, again, as I mentioned, of teaching in higher education around our field over the last decade plus. And I really became a student of the field when I started teaching. And it's important for us to understand, given the critical importance of agencies gravitating towards creating financial sustainability or cost recovery strategies today, to understand to a degree, in a very abbreviated period of time, how we got here. So I promise this will be the quickest history lesson you've ever had. But very simply, the public park and recreation profession was birthed in this space and place that you see on the screen, Boston Common, back in the 1600s. Many people believe our profession kind of started with the National Park Service or maybe at Central Park, and that is not the case. This space really represented the idea of an open space, open access, a public space that we all owned, that we potentially, based upon privilege, had the opportunity to utilize. Really, what we're suggesting here is that this was intended to be an open access, publicly owned space in our communities that anybody could use, again, based upon their opportunities and access. But you see no yoga mats here. You see no rec centers. There are no day camps. This was a commons that we, again, all owned. And so our profession was birthed on the backs of these open lands. Over time, we graduated, we evolved. There was a bit of a renaissance in our field. And if you fast forward a couple of hundred years, we did see the evolution, the creation, the development, the design, the adoption of our National Park Service. We saw spaces like Central Park come online. And we started to suggest that government would take a more active role in providing parks, spaces, recreation services in our communities. If we fast forward again to post-World War II, during World War II, many of you recognize we were rather poor as government, but not long after World War II, we became a little bit more fat, if you will. We had a little bit more money in the bank, and we started to make broad commitments across the United States to provide more services in the park and recreation space to our communities. We started to have more playgrounds, more neighborhood centers, ultimately more community centers, and more services. And we were suggesting at this time they would be free, but we also recognized they weren't free. Taxpayers were supporting those services for their communities. Fast forward again to the 80s, we saw now the evolution and the adoption of many very large recreation centers across the United States. I reside currently in the state of Colorado. We started to see 100, 120, 130, 150,000 square foot facilities. We were investing in these spaces in our society at a very rapid pace. As you all know, we fast forward a little bit more in time to 2007, 8, 9, and this is when the recession hit. And we started to use phrase and terminology just like they did in other sectors, lean organizations, do more with less, because our community expectations now had been heightened to a certain level where we had truly become a profession of something for everyone all the time. Yet we recognized that we were a bit resource stretched. We also recognized there were other providers in our communities at this point in time. The other public sector entities, nonprofit sector entities, as well as the private sector, were beginning to provide more and more recreation-related services. So it really begged the question for us, how do we best invest and spend our taxpayer resources in order to have the greatest impact on our communities? How do we ensure that we're not stretching ourselves too thin, that we're not creating these duplication exercises and efforts in our communities where we're stepping on each other's toes? And ultimately, we want to ensure that we're not really fragmenting our resources. So this becomes a bit of a foundational message around how we think about financial sustainability moving forward. Where is it as a local governmental entity we should be putting our resources in this moment in time in order to have the greatest impacts on our communities? And what is it potentially that we no longer can continue to provide? So we've gone from a profession that was birthed on the backs of public lands to a profession now, again, that's really become a profession of something for everyone all the time. And so again, this becomes a bit foundational for us in terms of how we think about using our resources as we move forward. I'm going to share a couple of additional insights with you this evening. This is a balance sheet that it debuted, if you will, as a result of some research that was done in our profession as a result of the last recession. We have a gentleman who's one of the more recognized high-profile academics in our profession at Penn State University. His name is Dr. Andy Mullen. And he actually wanted to test two hypotheses. One was how essential is public parks and recreation. The other was specific to the Great Recession's profound impact on our profession. What you see here was what he started his research based upon, and it was very simply his collection of information that gave us the impression that the public sector was not necessarily be very sound with its resources. I think we would all recognize, I will use this on occasion in different workshops and work sessions. I'll ask folks, if this was your personal checkbook, it was representative of your personal checkbook, what would your reaction be? We would take corrective action pretty quickly. But we understood that the public sector back in 2007, 8, 9 was beginning to see its expenditure lines growing, if you will, at a faster pace than its revenues. And so this set the stage for Andy and his team to begin to think about, what are we facing now as a public park and recreation profession and industry in the United States? He did this study that he called The Great Recession's Profound Impact on Parks and Recreation. I'm going to share with you just a couple of data sets that I think are very important to share as they relate to the why this work is so important today. This research study was conducted in 2017, and I think that's important for us to understand. Again, looking back on the profound impact that the 2007, 8, 9 years had and the economic volatility that we faced on the park and recreation field. If you'd like to get a little bit more information about this study, all you simply need to do is Google the Great Recession's profound impact on parks and recreation. But there are two data sets that I'm going to share with you this evening that, again, I think speak volumes to why this is so critically important to us today. This work is important to us today. The first just is a quick illustration of the spending patterns that we saw between 1989 and 2013. And I do share in some settings, this is a bit of a reflection on my career. I started as a sports coordinator in a special district in Illinois in 1989. And we were living large in parks and recreation. This is, again, where we were spending a lot of money. We were building a lot of things. We were assuming a lot of assets on the backs of our communities. We saw an increase in our spending of 63% between 89 and 2003. 2003 to 2008, we saw additional increase. So between that, 1989 and 2008 period, that 20-year window, we had seen an 80% increase in our spending in local park and recreation systems. But in 2008, we all recognized what happened. We saw a bit of a decline here, a decrease. And between 2008 and 2013, we saw a 21% decrease. And we also recognized that our communities weren't willing to say, well, we'll assume a 21% decrease in the service menu provided. We had set a standard and an expectation on our community's behalfs relative to what their expectations of parks and recreation were. And at the same time, we were starting to become, again, those lean organizations having to do more with less. Alternatively, there was another set of data that resulted from Andy's work, and I think this is among the more profound parts of his research, and it really carries forward to our realities today. These were our total expenditures as a profession over the course of the windows of time that you see here, 2008, 2013. So you can see the total expenditures represented by the blue and the red bars, but you can see the breakdown in how we were distributing those total expenditures amongst our operating side of the fence, our operating budget, in contrast to our capital. Think our capital investments, our assets, our infrastructure. And what you see over time is that in 2000, we were putting 66% of our total bucket into operating and almost 34% into capital. If we fast forward to 2008, again, we were living pretty large at this point. Almost 72% of the total expenditure there of $40.7 billion was being directed to our operating, while now only 29% of that total was going to our capital. And finally, if you fast forward over to 2013, we of course saw a decline, a diminishing investment in parks and recreation. Our expenditures were reduced, but more of our budget was going towards operating while less was going towards capital. Now, there are a number of theories and hypotheses around why this happened. Some suggested it's simply because it was very difficult for us to make service reduction decisions. We didn't want to let our staff go. We didn't want to cut our service menu. And it was easier to defer our capital investments, defer our maintenance. It wasn't as obvious. It wasn't as tangible to folks. You know, we could put duct tape on something. We could say we can get another year out of that irrigation system. We can get another year out of something in our system, and people won't notice. And it's contributed to the infrastructure crisis in our profession. We know we have an infrastructure crisis in the United States, but we have an infrastructure crisis in public parks and recreation. We've got systems across the country that are now acknowledging they have $1 billion in maintenance backlog. These are just park and recreation systems. So it really comes down to the choices, the investment choices, the spending choices we have made as a profession, and they've really led us to this place in time. We really are waiting with bated breath to see what that next bar graph looks like in 2022. I do know Andy quite well. Early suggestions are it is not going to be very encouraging. The suggestion is we would have put even more of our budget into the operating side of the fence with less into capital. But again, it speaks to the investment choices we've made, how we've been spending and using our taxpayer resources, and what we have realized as a result of those choices today. A few other things that I think are important for us to understand, again, relative to the why this work is so important. Shortly after the pandemic hit us, it was about 9-10 months later, the State of Local Government Survey, which is released through the International City County Management Association, revealed these results that 7 out of 10 local governments were expecting to see moderate, significant, or major financial adjustments being needed due to the pandemic. While some systems were doing pretty well and they expect to continue to do well, it just simply spoke to the temperature of local governments as it related to the pandemic and what we were planning to see relative to budget challenges. And as you all know, we're in the midst of a very interesting economic time. You know, our inflation rates have been up and down, although they seem to be coming down a little bit right now. They're still over 7% on average across the United States. And many systems have yet to see what that inflation impact has been on their organizations, particularly systems that are on a fiscal year calendar. So into 2023, when those actuals reveal themselves, we're going to likely see our expenditures significantly outpacing our revenues in local park and recreation systems, as well as other forms of local government. We've got a series of we call it an intersection of various conditions that are impacting our profession today. Again, I don't want to suggest it's only relegated to parks and recreation, but these are the things that we talk about often in our field. And we have these very intensive and immersive conversations with professionals all across the United States. So they're not happening in any one region, they're happening across the United States. We know we have a lot of economic uncertainty. Obviously, we're here this evening to react and respond to that so that this system is very fiscally healthy and well moving forward. We've got a public health crisis, and it is not relegated to COVID. We have an opioid epidemic. We have obesity concerns across the United States. And we're a profession that hang our hats on being the leader when it comes to health and wellness. So it really challenges us to think about where we are investing and spending our resources and how we are influencing health indicators in our communities. We know we have a lot of social unrest and chaos, and we at times are we're kind of given the badge of being the organization that helps strengthen the social fabric in our communities. We've got significant and increasing disparities in needs in our communities across the country. COVID did not necessarily create that. It simply was an opportunity for us to look behind the curtain. It was a bit of a reveal for us. And again, as a profession that's all about social connection in communities, it speaks to us relative to how do we invest these resources in order to bring our communities together today. We have lack of revenue diversification in many local systems across the country. Many organizations are heavily reliant on taxpayer resources. You know, we all know personally, we hear often about diversifying your portfolio, yet we often don't do that in our organizations. We have found over the last couple of years, largely because of the economic impacts on our profession, that we have limited financial literacy in our profession. I do credit Rochelle and John and the entire team with really embracing this work and understanding the importance of it and elevating their financial literacy as professionals representing their community. Maintenance backlogs are a huge problem. I referenced that briefly here. The city of Austin, Texas has $1.3 billion in maintenance backlog just in parks and recreation. State of Pennsylvania park system has $1 billion. City of New York has $6 billion. These are real stories that are beginning to reveal themselves in our profession, and many organizations today are committing themselves to understanding what is their maintenance backlog so they can address it in a more intentional way. Unfortunately, it's one of the problems in government in general is we have uninformed constituents. Many don't understand how their taxpayer dollars are being used. And so it's incumbent upon us to think about how we can better inform and help them understand where their taxpayer resources are going. So when we have conversations about financial sustainability, they are more informed and they can be more engaged in the discussions. This at times, unfortunately, has led to unreasonable expectations. We only have so many resources. We used to talk about limited resources. Today, we now use the term finite resources. How do we best use those in order to have the greatest impact? And it's really keeping at bay the idea that simply by virtue of paying taxes, people believe that they're entitled to anything that government provides and more. So it's a little bit of a conflict for us in terms of how we respond to community demand and interest and need, alternatively ensuring that we're not overextending ourselves. We have staffing deficiencies across the country, and many organizations are trying to figure out how to navigate that reality. What services do we provide and which do we not, and so on. And then we have struggling competitors in our communities, those that are partners of ours. And the challenge here, of course, is when we have another partner in our community, particularly in the private sector, that is impacted negatively and potentially they go away, it dilutes the very tax base upon which we've all become dependent. And so there are a lot of things happening. It seems a bit doom and gloom. It's very sobering. But at times, as we go through this work, we recognize and we call kind of a check and a timeout and a pause, and we say, but it's an opportunity for us to think about in this moment, how do we best invest and spend our taxpayer resources in order to, again, have the greatest impact on our community. So this work for us falls under this umbrella of what we call Parks and Reconomics. It's a way for us to, I think, appeal to the masses in our world, the 8,000 plus park and rec systems across the country, and challenge each one of us to think about the question, how do we best manage our finite resources in this moment in time in order to have the greatest impact on our communities? You all recognize in your roles as representative community members that it's important for you to be responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars. It's among the most important things that you can do on behalf of your community. That is indeed the case for the professionals that serve communities as well, understanding they have the privilege of being the stewards of taxpayer resources. Every day they are spending other people's money. And so how do they think philosophically about ensuring that they're doing it in the most responsible, intelligent way so that they have, again, great impact on their community? We like to start this work with a very basic question to all professionals, all board members, council members, commissioners, selectmen, whoever it is that we have the chance to have some airtime with. And it's simply this, are you smart about managing money? And of course, we don't want to think about it in this case relative to our own personal checkbooks, but how are we spending and investing taxpayer dollars? So it becomes very fundamental and foundational to the work around create a financial sustainability strategy that makes sense for organizations in this moment in time, and being, again, responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars. It's important for us to consider a couple of very common terms that are instrumental and critical to this work. One, of course, is cost recovery. And unfortunately, this term, this phrase over the last 2 decades plus has had a bit of an ick factor in our field. Many people assume that it has everything to do with raising fees and pricing people out of the market. And it's really in conflict with our nobility as a social service profession. And that couldn't be any further from the truth. The very simple reality is that cost recovery is about how we are going to philosophically determine how we're going to recover or offset the costs or expenses associated with delivering services. But of course, as you can imagine, we need to understand what our expenses are in order to make this decision, this very important decision. The cost recovery simply is what you see on the screen. It's recovering or offsetting the costs associated with services. And it may be a percentage of, it may be all of. Alternatively, we have terms like subsidy or tax investment, or how we use taxpayer dollars. That's the alternative to cost recovery, right? It's the other side of the coin. And if we think about tax use or tax investment, or how we spend taxpayer resources, or subsidy, very simply, what it is, it's a benefit that's given by government. Anytime we subsidize a service or offset cost recovery with how we're going to use people's taxes, it's a benefit. And it's intended typically to remove some kind of burden and often considered to be in the overall interest of our general public, our common good. It alternatively is also given or gifted to promote a social good or an economic policy. So we have two sides of the coin. We have cost recovery and we have tax use. Cost recovery or subsidy, depending on the terminology that an organization chooses. If we have cost recovery of 50%, then our subsidy investment or tax investment is 50%. Ultimately, the intention here is that we've reached 100%. But these are very important terms that help set the stage for the work around financial sustainability strategy. And again, ensuring that we're not conflating these terms with something that they're not. But the intention of all of this work at the end of the day is to connect reality and communities with policy, the realities of organizations, the realities of the communities they serve, with the policy that's created around how they are going to spend and invest these taxpayer resources with the intention of community impact. One of the things I'll share here before I hit pause is that we often, and I will say again, as a 20-year practicing professional, this work can sometimes not be embraced. Many folks in the park and rec profession have huge social service hearts, and they really believe that kind of the business acumen, the business side of the fence needs to be set over here because it's all about serving community. And while in many cases that might be true, alternatively, I think we've begun to understand more so than we ever have, is that in order to continue to do the good work we need to do in our communities today, in order to carry forward our social service purpose, we've got to be able to pay the bills. We've got to be able to ensure that we can support the services that communities need of us in this moment in time by way of our financial health and well-being. And so it's a balancing act. All of this work around financial sustainability and public parks and recreation today has become an incredible balancing act. And I'm very encouraged because we have organizations like Sandy Parks and Recreation and others who are gravitating towards this understanding that it's critically important to the long-term health, well-being of their community, and obviously the legacy of the park and rec systems in their communities as well for future generations. So at this point, I'm going to hit a quick pause. I've shared a bit of the foundational information around why this is so critically important to the park and recreation world today. But I'd like to see if you have any thoughts, comments, questions before I move into the methodology and the details around the process that we're using alongside the staff to help create a financial sustainability strategy for the organization.
I have a comment.
Sure.
So I'm on your screen where you've defined the tax use subsidy thing. If you could put that up, it's just a few screens back. You were just talking about it.
You bet.
And I don't know if you can get there. There you go. Nope, one. There you go. So, because Rochelle and I kind of had to go around a few times because the term subsidy, I think a lot of people think subsidy, subsidized housing, things like that, where folks are basically not necessarily paying taxes, but we're subsidizing their rental income because they don't have income to pay their rent and all that. And so the one thing that, and let me just preface everything with, that I'm totally supportive of cost recovery. I'm also 35-year parks and recreation manager with, huge amounts of responsibilities and very low budgets and huge reliance on volunteers and grants and all that stuff. So I totally get where we are and where we're going and where we need to be. I just think that it's, when we talk about subsidy, it just really rubs me wrong to say, using the property taxes that our residents are paying and saying that, we're giving them a benefit, we're using our tax dollars to provide park services. And that's what they're expecting. I don't think it's necessarily a subsidy or a benefit. That's how we're choosing to, we're using the money they're giving us and providing them a service. And I don't see that as some extra benefit that they're not entitled to. I think that's where they want to see their tax dollars go. And I guess I'll just end the whole thing with, I wish we had as much emphasis on cost recovery in other departments, like, because 75 to 80% of our general fund is in the police. and we need every dollar we spend in the police. And I'm not saying that we need to cut it, but there doesn't appear to be any kind of.
We're
effort.
really off topic here.
I know, but well, it isn't, because, we're talking about really charging people to use our park services and facilities and things like that. And so it is.
Kathleen, are you going to change the definition of tax use or subsidy tonight? Or can we move forward as two bodies trying to figure out best practices?
It's just that word of subsidy that's, like I said, I talked to Rochelle about it, and it's just a real stickler for me to kind of even imply that we are subsidizing park services when we're using our tax dollars for that. So it's just a hard sell for me on that particular term. I support a lot of the rest of it, and I'm excited to hear more about, the options. But when we talk to the public, that's kind of a red line term that we probably want to reconsider a different term that has less, red flag connotations. Thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Carl, see a hand up. Carl, you're muted, bud. Just
Yeah, there it is. Have to push the right button. Yeah, in terms of, I'd like to stay on subject as well. I think that we need to figure out what it is we can afford and then just fund that as close to 100% as we possibly can. Anything that is beyond that is just unacceptable. Now, some of our public, I think, would want us to do certain things. So I think we should be looking at what our public demands or what our public really wants. And if we go into subsidies, we're going into, in my mind, into some troubled areas. So I think we need to be careful about how we move forward on these kind of projects. I really think we need to look at how that balance between what we can afford and what we have.
Other thoughts, comments that you'd like to share this evening? I noticed there were a few comments in the chat. Don had included, I think this trend is greater operating expense versus capital is not unique to parks. I think it's typical of any capital intensive industry. I would completely agree. The unfortunate result of that is now we have significant maintenance backlogs in our profession. And so while indeed that may be typical, it's become hugely problematic. And I will speak specifically to the local park and recreation profession. Don also asked. Sure.
That second question is really you made the comment in passing that ideally we would have 100% when you were talking about that balance. Can you just clarify what you meant by 100% and why that's?
Yeah, and clarification, Don, I did not say ideally. I was just using 100% as an example. So if we have a 50% cost recovery, we're going to have a 50% investment of tax dollars to offset that. So that's not ideal. That was just to share an example.
Oh, okay. You're just talking about the balance. We need to account for everything.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Yep. Thank you. Don also added, I think we need to be careful when applying a framework or model. The framework will define terms like tax use subsidy for the framework. We just have to understand how the definitions are used in the framework. And I'm going to share some examples with you of that a bit later. I've not gotten yet into the methodology that we use, but as we do, if you have additional comments, please feel free to share those.
And my point to that is you're going to define terms that might be different than how we would normally use them. For the sake of our discussion, we just have to adopt that definition and move forward with it. I mean, that's part of the framework. So that's what I was trying to say there.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think what would help for me to get clear on, and I did kind of review the materials and stuff, is that, unlike Austin or, these huge cities, we don't have a pool, we don't have a gym, we don't have we have a small community center, and we have parks and we have trails. And so I get the idea of trying to do cost recovery for, the athletic sports, the sports teams, and renting the center and, holding classes at the center and all. I think where I get confused is, you kind of throw in all parks, use of parks, our dog park, our trails and things like that. And so I get a little confused when we're talking about cost recovery as to what of those types of facilities and uses you're wanting to include in cost recovery. So it would really help me to, it's kind of apples, oranges, and pears, and lots of other things in there. So it's just would be helpful to kind of clarify a little bit on, are we just talking about things where we can actually charge people and they're using a service, or we're providing a specific service?
Yeah, so Kathleen, if you'll, once we get into this next section, I think some of your questions will be answered. And please understand, when I throw out Austin and some of these large systems, it's just simply to share with you some of the strife and the chaos and the challenges we're facing. We've got small systems that have no facilities that, they might have a handful of parks that need $10 million in capital investment that they don't have. So we could talk about $1 million, we can talk about $1 billion. Nonetheless, the reality in this world is that we are seeing a significant amount of maintenance backlog across the United States, regardless of size of system. And it comes down to how organizations are choosing to spend and invest their taxpayer resources. And so it's foundational to the importance of this work. And this first part I shared with you is just simply speaking to the why this is a critically important exercise and conversation in local park and recreation systems today. So I'm going to go ahead and move into the methodology. So you have a really solid sense of the work that staff have been doing to help create philosophy for the system as they move forward. I mentioned at the onset of this meeting that the methodology that I'd share with you this evening has been used by many systems across the United States, actually across North America. We refer to it very simply as a three-legged stool. It adds a bit of frivolity to what can sometimes be considered a rather intensive exercise. Most people that are in the social service professions, like Parks and Recreation, don't particularly gravitate towards data. So the intention here is we make this very easy to understand. It's a very fluid process, and it's a logic model in many ways. And the intention is, by way of following the legs of the stool, completing the legs of the stool, ultimately organizations will have created a tax use and revenue enhancement philosophy, how they're going to invest and spend taxpayer dollars, and how they're going to think about revenue enhancement to create these sustainable systems, these sustainable models. This philosophy is really the foundation for the strategy that the organization employs. The three legs of the stool are those that you see on the screen: the development of service categories, going through a beneficiary of service exercise, which you're going to be doing this evening, and then going through a comprehensive cost of service analysis. I'm going to break each of these legs down this evening so you have a solid understanding of how this works and what it looks like and feels like for the professional staff. So service categorization is a very different way for us to approach bucketing our services in parks and recreation. I mentioned I've been in this field 30 plus years. We had a philosophy that was established by our national association back in the late 80s and 90s that was a benchmark for cost recovery in public parks and recreation. And while it was really great and noble at the time, it was unfortunate that it was flawed, because the suggestion was every system across the country, regardless of size, regardless of demographics, was going to follow the same benchmarking approach. And so we understood that it was going to be problematic at a point in time, and it actually did become hugely problematic because our cost recovery goals were established in a rather arbitrary fashion. Service categories allow us to think a little differently about creating a cost recovery or a financial sustainability strategy. And it again is the first leg of the stool that really sets the stage for this work. Categories are a different way of thinking about bucketing services by way of bucketing services based upon their purpose. So I'm going to walk you through a very brief example, and these are all recreation services. You don't see any parks or examples here, but this is again just to share how this looks and how it feels and what categories are and what they're not. So we've got three different services on the screen here. On the left, you have, let's assume for a moment, this is an intro to fitness class for older adults. So the service itself is intro to fitness. Any course, class, event, activity, rental, any experience provided to a community could fall under the umbrella of a service. So the service is intro to fitness. The service area is seniors. In many systems across the country, we bucket our functions by area, like service, seniors, aquatics, sports, parks, etc. So intro to fitness is the service, seniors is the service area. And let's say, for argument's sake, this evening, we have a cost recovery goal for our senior area of 25%. You move to the middle, we have a service, which is learn to swim. The service area is aquatics, and that cost recovery goal for aquatics is 40%. Alternatively, on the right, you see we have a service being T-ball. The service area is youth sports, and our cost recovery goal you see listed there as 50%. Now, this is how we have approached cost recovery in Parks and Recreation for many years. We have determined goals based upon service areas. And the unfortunate reality is social values tend to influence how we think about cost recovery in many systems across the country. We might suggest, hypothetically, that in our community, older adults are on fixed incomes, they've been paying taxes for many years, and we don't want to necessarily raise their fees, so we're going to keep their cost recovery expectation low. In the middle, we might assume that aquatics is a very important service in our community. Maybe we have some big advocates in our community that are active, and they suggest that everybody should have an opportunity to learn to swim. And we're going to still keep the cost recovery goal low, let's say 40%. Alternatively, on the right, we might say every child should have the opportunity to participate in sport, contributes to their emotional, physical, social growth and well-being. And again, we're going to keep the cost recovery goal low. I'm being somewhat facetious here, but these are indeed how we have thought about setting cost recovery goals. They've been incredibly arbitrary, and at times we have imposed our social values into the discussions. What we want to do through service categorization is get away from assumptions around a service area or a particular population and think about service categorization based upon purpose. And what that allows us to do now is see these three services and these three service areas a little bit differently. What we find is an intro to fitness class, regardless of the population, a learn to swim program, regardless of the population, and a T-ball program are all about introducing someone to a recreational activity. It's about a novice level activity, a learn to type of activity. And what we begin to find then is rather than these services being in different service areas with different service categories or different service category expectations relative to cost recovery, they're all going to be in the same category with the same cost recovery goal. And so we work with systems to create service categories that represent their service menus. You have, as part of this invite this evening, a list of categories that were created by staff as the content matter experts in the organization to represent the service menu for Sandy, Oregon Park and Recreation Department. There are 10 categories represented here, along with definitions as well as examples to help create an explicit understanding of the kind of categories that are provided by way of the services through the organization. We're going to use these in a bit as the foundation for the exercise I'm going to ask you to complete this evening. But there are 10 services listed, and they're in no other order than alphabetical for tonight's purposes. Many people will ask me, how many categories are typical? We've been doing this a long time. Just in the last 2 years, we've worked with over 100 organizations across the country. The average is anywhere between 9 and 15. But frankly, we've had some smaller systems with 15 categories, and we've had some larger systems with as few as 9. So the important thing is that every service is represented in some way, shape, or form by a category. The definitions are explicit, and there are a series of examples that can help explain the kinds of services that would exist under the umbrella of each category. Again, we're going to go through these very deliberately here shortly. So we have our service categories created for Sandy, Oregon. John and the team actually worked very hard to get these in place. But the next leg of the stool is the beneficiary of service. And this is really one of the reasons that you're here this evening, is to go through the exercise. But allow me to just create a little bit of some context and a greater understanding of what beneficiary of service and why it's so important to this work. So if we go back again and think about a more conventional example, we might suggest that our aquatics division in our hypothetical organization has a cost recovery expectation of 75%. But when we begin to really dissect this, we understand we have a number of different kinds of services that may be in our service area of aquatics. And they may include, among the many services, the two that you see on the screen. On the left, let's say we have a learn to swim program, and on the right, we may have a master swim team. And if we really think about this relative to beneficiary and things like access, we begin to understand that the service on the left likely has a greater opportunity to reach a broader audience. Regardless of our ability or skill, we're able to participate. And on the right, a master swim team tends to be a little bit more exclusive and specialized, right? We have to have a particular mastery of a skill, a higher level of ability in order to participate. So it really challenges us when it comes down to cost recovery. We begin to say, well, should both of these kinds of services, regardless of whether or not they're in the same service area, have the same cost recovery expectation? And what we find through this work is we're going to see services within the same service areas exist within different kinds of categories. Again, think about like purpose. So the service on the left, as an example, might exist in a category like beginner level activities, while the service on the right is going to live and exist within another kind of category, maybe something like competitive level or advanced level activities. Ultimately, again, we're thinking about beneficiary of service. And so this allows us to see our service menu through a different lens. And obviously all of our services exist in different kinds of categories. The handout on the screen is the one we're going to use here shortly. I just want to make sure that everybody has this, but this is the beneficiary of service exercise I'm going to ask you to complete a bit later. And I'm going to be, again, deliberate in explaining the categories as well as the ask of you tonight. But I'm hoping that you have this handy. If not, I'll just ask you to go ahead and complete the work on a blank sheet of paper. But I'm going to walk through this with everyone so that we're all very clear about what the request is of you this evening and exactly how this exercise is going to work. So what we're doing is we're connecting the dots between the service categories of the organization and who it is that benefits. And ultimately, what you're going to be doing this evening, and I can't overstate the importance of your work tonight as representative community members, is you're going to help design what we refer to as a beneficiary of service model. And it becomes one of the first iterations of the financial sustainability strategy of the organization. I'm going to ask you to rank, not prioritize, but rank the categories of the organization from those you believe align most with the common good. And I'm going to share a definition of that with you in addition to some other definitions to help take a rather subjective exercise and make it as objective as we possibly can, to categories that you believe are highly individualized, right? They're more exclusive, they're more specialized. There's not as great of access to the broader community. And ultimately what we do, of course, then is we begin to see this visual representation of the model. And what we're ultimately going to find is the organization will make a greater taxpayer investment commitment to those services that align more with the common good and less of a taxpayer investment commitment to those services that are more individualized, potentially even seeing opportunities for excess revenue generation that can be reinvested back into the organization. And in your case, as is the case with the vast majority of park and rec systems across the country, you're still going to be relying on taxpayer resources to support the menu of the organization and likely not have a 100% cost recovery or more business model for Sandy Parks and Recreation. And finally, the cost of service work is really it's the kind of the backbone, it's the heavy lift of this work. And this is where we work with organizations to collect all of their revenues and expenditures, allowing us to help them understand what it costs them to provide every service in the system. So we get very granular. We want to account for Rochelle's salary and benefits, all of the overhead, the global expenses, the facility expenses, the parks expenses, as well as the indirect costs, and attribute all of those expenses to every service. So you have a better understanding of what your current cost recovery performance is. I use this metaphor, if you will, often in this work. We have over time seen that local governments, well, actually just say governments as a whole, tend to only account for direct costs when they think about cost of service. The encouraging thing is in the last decade or so, we're seeing more governments making a concerted effort to understand their indirect expenses. And principally, this is so important because when we say we're hypothetically at 80% cost recovery, but we're only accounting for direct costs, and we're really only at 25%, we are misrepresenting our fiscal reality. So it allows us to be more true and to our constituents and to ourselves relative to cost recovery performance. And it allows us a better baseline from which to work. We begin to understand the true costs associated with all of the services we deliver communities. Again, there's a bit of optimism here because we are seeing a bit of a tipping point. I'm not sure I can credit it entirely with what we've seen over the last couple of years, but nonetheless, we see more organizations committed to understanding their cost of doing business. Now, as Rochelle and I spoke, we thought it might be helpful for you to have just a high-level understanding of how we think about this and how we approach it in our work. And for those of you that are maybe in the private sector, this is going to seem pretty obvious to you. But we use this example a lot in our trainings with professional staff and obviously in workshops like this, so people can understand really how we think about cost of service work. So I'll start here with this high-level example. These are going to be rather brief, but if we think about this relative to an ice cream shop, just one individual ice cream shop, and you think about cost of service, it becomes a rather simple exercise. In this particular example, this shop sells one thing. It sells ice cream cones, and during its last fiscal year, it sold 50,000 cones. Its direct costs, as you see on the screen, were their ice cream, their cones, and their napkins, which totaled $50,000 or $1 per cone. But when they started to think about their indirect expenses, like their utilities and their management and their landscaping, their equipment, they understood that those expenses equaled $100,000. We simply add the direct to the indirect. We've got $150,000 in expenses. We think about the $50,000 or 50,000 cones that we sold, and what we find was that each cone essentially cost us $3. If we begin to think about this in a more complicated or complex fashion, we think about it relative to multiple locations. We now understand that likely every location is going to have varying revenues, and they're also going to have varying costs. We also understand we're going to have some shared resources amongst these locations, things like our senior management, our finance folks, our HR, our landscaping, et cetera. So our cost of service at each of these separate locations is going to become a bit more complicated and complex in terms of how to calculate that out. And the reason I share this is because we are now translating this work to a rather complex profession. Some systems are small, some systems are large, but nonetheless, many park and rec systems offer hundreds, if not thousands, of services annually. They have a number of different kinds of unique direct costs. Swim lessons are not the same as a day camp, or not the same as a park shelter rental, and so on. We also know we have globally shared costs and resources, our senior management. So Rochelle and John and other senior administrators in the organization. You have finance, you have HR, you have landscaping, right? And so on the story goes. So we start to then think about what are these globally shared costs, or our indirect costs, that we need to now think about attributing to every service we provide in our system. And then, of course, we have location-based shared costs as well. So it really speaks to the complexity of this work, and ensuring that as we collect these revenues and expenditures, we're doing our best to attribute all of those expenses appropriately to all of the services that are offered in the organization. So it gives you an idea of how we think about cost of service through this work. Finally, I share a couple of examples of what the end products, if you will, look like, the strategies that result at the end of the methodology, the end of the work. The example you see on the screen is representative of a special district in the Chicago metro area. Their strategy, they've called a financial sustainability strategy. This one was adopted in 2022. You can see their service categories represented on their continuum. They actually engage their professional staff as well as their policymaking board. This special district has a board that is elected by its constituents, its residents. And as a result of their service category development, their beneficiary service exercise with their staff, as well as their community representative board, and the cost of service work, they were able to see their current cost recovery performance that allowed them, through a series of exercises following some guiding principles, to establish goals that they felt were very appropriate for their organization, particularly based upon how reliant they could continue to be on the general fund or on their taxpayer resources. This is a rather ambitious model in many cases, simply by virtue of the fact that you see beginning with competitive activities right there in the middle, just slightly left of middle. They're now suggesting that no taxpayer resources will be directed to those services. And once you get up into rentals, all the way up to resales, they're suggesting they want to see a cost recovery above 100%. In their case, they have a heavy load of infrastructure needs, as well as some social equity interests that they want to address that they believe they have not addressed historically. But this gives you an idea of one organization's model. While every system follows the same methodology, no two models are alike, right? Every organization is different. Perspectives are different. Obviously, building the beneficiary of service model is going to be different based upon those folks who participate in the work and their perspectives. So that gives you one idea of what one model might look like. So where we're headed as a result of this work is creating a financial sustainability strategy for Sandy Parks and Recreation. Again, your work this evening is incredibly important relative to the placement of the categories on the continuum. We're going to be going through that beneficiary of service exercise here in a moment. And what you're going to be doing is helping create the first iteration of the model where we'll be placing the categories based upon your perspectives and your opinions relative to their alignment with common good and their alignment with the idea of individualized benefit. So I'm going to go ahead and pause one more time as a result of walking you through the methodology before we get to the exercise this evening and see if you have any additional thoughts, questions, comments you'd like to share.
So I have a question about how, because what I'm understanding is that the actual cost of providing the service, indirect and direct costs, is a huge factor in all this. And so again, you guys, a lot of the slides and stuff talked about providing, swim lessons and things like that, and we don't have a pool. So but just as that is an example, providing swim lessons and operating and maintaining a pool has a far different cost center than, say, having a little kinder, play time for, some moms or dads and kids. So given that those are kind of both, common good type things, but have way different cost centers to provide those services, how do you, is that a later step in the process, or how do you reconcile that?
So the example with the pools was just that. It was simply an example of how we think about attributing expenses. You have to understand that there are direct costs as well as indirect costs associated with every service, whether it's a kinder camp, whether it's a swim lesson, whether it's a park shelter rental. So that was just simply intended to provide you an example of how we need to think about attributing all of your indirect expenses to the appropriate services. We're going to be getting to the beneficiary of service work here in a moment. We're going to be walking through this exercise together, and we're going to be categorizing. I'm going to be asking you to take the categories and rank them from the category you believe aligned most with the common good to the one that you believe is most individualized. We aren't going to be looking at individual services simply because of the importance of ensuring that we're kind of checking social values at the door, and we're looking at like purpose services. So you're going to be seeing categories and ranking those. You're not going to be ranking individual services for the organization. So there's kind of two things at work here. Number one, it's just understanding that we're attributing direct and indirect expenses to all services, regardless of how big or small. And then you're going to be ranking categories, not individual services, from those you believe align most with the common good to those that you believe are most individualized. And hopefully this will all kind of come to light for you as we go through this exercise in a few minutes.
Jamie, I think there was a thing or two in the chat as well. Carl, you unmuted. Usually that means you want to say something.
Yeah, I figured out where the mute button was this time. For me, there's a lot of conversation that could happen, but I quite frankly would love to see the exercise and then go from that to figure out what my questions would be. So, there's a lot of conversations that could happen, but I've only had 15 years in Parks and Recreation in my career, so I don't have as much as maybe Kathleen might, but I think a number of us have different opinions. So I'd love to see the exercise to figure out what my conditions are.
Sounds good. All right. Okay, so this is the beneficiary of service work. And again, I can't thank you all enough for taking the time to not only listen to some context around the importance of this work to the field, but obviously also share with you the methodology that we're using, working alongside the staff to create their strategy. So I'm going to be rather deliberate, as I mentioned, walking through this to ensure that everybody feels comfortable and confident going through the exercise tonight. I'm hoping you all have a copy of the service categories as well as the exercise. If you don't, you're going to just have to hit pause here, and we'll do our best to ensure that you can get through this without actually having the handouts. I will make sure when I ask you to begin the beneficiary of service work, I'll make sure that these service categories are on the screen for you. But I want to just walk through each of these categories with you one at a time. Rochelle and John and other staff are on the line with you this evening. So if you have any questions, you need clarification on any of the categories, once I've gone through these with you, it'll be a good time to ask before we actually get into the details of the beneficiary of service activity itself. So you have 10 categories that represent all services provided by Sandy Parks and Recreation. Each category includes a definition as well as a series of examples to help clarify exactly what it means, exactly what it includes. So I'm going to start at the top of page 1. We're going to work our way through all 10 categories. And again, I'll open the floor for any questions that you have before we get to the activity. So the first category are your advanced competitive level classes and activities. These are classes and activities designed to advance or master a skill. In the case of team or league play, scoring is kept with winning as a primary goal. Examples here are things like your power yoga program, parkour, softball leagues, 5th and 6th grade basketball. So again, advanced competitive level classes and activities. Your next category are your beginner and intermediate level classes and activities. These are classes and activities designed to teach or engage at an introductory or novice level. In the case of team or league play, there is no scoring with a focus on building foundational skills. Examples here include kinder dance, yoga and stretch, music and movement, skyhawks, 3rd and 4th grade youth basketball, intermediate parkour, and intermediate guitar lessons. Again, this is the beginner intermediate level classes and activities category. Next, you have community events. These are annual events designed to be inclusive of the entire community, regardless of age, ability, family composition, or special interest. Examples here include things like your Christmas tree lighting, music and movies in the park, holiday lights at Meinig, and Longest Day Parkway. Next are your drop-in activities. These are self-directed activities which include staff oversight and supervision and do not require registration. Again, they're self-directed activities with no supervision or oversight. Examples. If you guys wouldn't mind, if you could please just check your mics and make sure your mics are deactivated, I'd appreciate it. Your drop-in activities, again, are self-directed, which includes staff oversight and supervision and do not require registration. These are things like the Community and Senior Center Lounge drop-in, games and puzzles, cooling shelter, and open gym, and Silvertone. So again, self-directed activity, which includes staff oversight and supervision. Next are your education and enrichment activities. These are classes and activities designed to educate and teach personal, social, emotional, and life skills. Examples here include things like mental health classes, Medicare classes, and babysitting classes. Next are your human services. These are resources provided for the prevention and remediation of life challenges and to support those who need assistance ensuring independence and community connection. Examples here include Meals on Wheels, transportation services, case management, referrals, energy assistance, and congregate meals. The bottom of page 1 is your open access category. This includes access to your park, trails, and facilities where activity is self-directed by the user. There is no staff oversight or supervision. This includes your parks, your trails, your dog park, your playgrounds, your skate park, and your sport courts. Top of page 2, we have your rentals. These are reservations which provide exclusive use of public spaces and places by a group or individual. Examples here are your sport field rentals, auditorium rentals, art room rentals, dining room rentals, gazebo rentals, plaza rentals, community garden plot rentals. Your 9th category are your social equity services. This includes services that remove barriers and constraints to accessing park and recreation opportunities. Examples here include things like your inclusive egg hunt, shower cart, and Toto's Shuntos. And then your 10th category are your special events. These events are designed and targeted for a specific market niche. Examples of your services that live in this category include things like Noah's Quest, Corn Cross, Teen Egg Hunt, senior egg hunt, senior outings and trips, and your mountain festival kids events. So these are the 10 categories that have been created along with definitions and some examples that intend to represent the entire service menu for Sandy Parks and Recreation. And at this point, before we move into the activity, because you're going to be using the service categories to complete the exercise, I'm going to see if anybody has any questions at all that they'd like to ask, either myself or the staff.
What about attendance at these? Like, how many people in our community actually engage in these events? I mean, some are more popular categories than others. And is that something that we should weigh when considering kind of a community good versus an individual?
So that's a great question, Stan. We, through our work, find that participation is not a factor in weighing common good versus individualized benefit. And I'll give you a classic example. And this is just an example I've used over the years. Let's assume for a moment you have an after-school program for children that live in Section 8 housing, and you have 60 kids and they participate 5 days a week, 9 months out of the year. Alternatively, you have a major special event or a community event in your community where you draw 10,000 people for an hour and a half. The participation hours, the contact hours you have, and likely the impact that you have on those audiences, those two audiences are going to vary greatly. You're likely going to have a greater impact on those 60 children than you're ever going to have on the 10,000 people that come to your community event for 90 minutes. And so it really becomes irrelevant to the exercise around beneficiary. Rather, what we want to look at is the type of service you're providing or the category, who it's serving, and then again, the beneficiary by way of the definitions of common good and individualized. And I'm going to share with you some rather explicit definitions for common good and individualized benefit will hopefully help you. Such a great question. I hear it often.
Thank you. It looks like Don has a follow-up in the chat that he asked.
Just related to, should we ignore that a lot of our events are, drawing people from outside of the city?
Sure. Yeah, for the purposes of this exercise tonight, we look as part of the revenue generating and the expenditures, the cost of service work. We do look at that working with staff, your resident versus non-residents. That'll obviously translate to pricing recommendations and policy development. But for tonight's purposes, I'm going to ask you to focus simply on who benefits. But that's a great question, Don. Thank you.
So I asked a question in the chat regarding 501c3s. Is there any discount for registered charities or anything like that want to rent fields or other spaces like that?
So David, we're not, tonight, we're not talking about costs or revenues or fees. This is simply the beneficiary of service work. Once we get to the place where we've conducted the cost of service work, that may come into play. You'll notice, however, in these categories, there's no delineation between type of user group when it comes to rentals. The definition very simply is a rental's a rental. Once a user group of any kind or an individual uses it and it's a public space, nobody else in the community has access to that service. So that may be something that comes up later in the process when we start again looking at policy development. But for tonight, I'm simply going to ask you to focus on the beneficiary of service work, who benefits from the services. We're going to try to keep fees and charges out of this exercise tonight, which can sometimes be a little challenging.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions on the categories themselves before we get to the exercise? All right, well, hearing none, let's get to the exercise. And I am going to, this is the teacher in me coming out. Please pencils down until I say go. I'm going to be sharing hopefully some very important insights here to set the stage for the work. And I don't want you to miss any of those so that the exercise is as clear as it can possibly be for you. So I am going to, again, similarly to what I did with the categories, I'm going to walk you through this rather deliberately so that we're all on the same page. I'll open the floor for any questions, comments you have before I let you loose to do the work. So I'm going to start at the top of page 1. And a couple of paragraphs here just help create some context and again, probably further define what the ask is tonight. You'll notice here at the beginning, a financial resource allocation philosophy. Think about that. It's an academic way of saying a financial sustainability strategy. It will provide a foundation for Sandy Parks and Recreation to help differentiate your service based upon who benefits and therefore who should pay. And I always share this, 110%, any other consulting firm out there, nobody owns this approach or this IP, this methodology. Economists have differentiated goods and services in the U.S. economy based upon beneficiary for decades. So I just want to make sure that that's very clear. Determining the beneficiary of your services, so who benefits, becomes a principal driver or primary driver in how your organization is going to begin to make informed and defensible taxpayer investment decisions. Following this concept, each of the organization service categories have a specific set of characteristics. So those definitions and those examples we just walked through that will provide a rationale for who should pay, whether it's the taxpayers, the individual, or maybe a little bit of both. And so I want to direct your attention to the two definitions in the body of page 1. Common good. So your common good services, I'd like you to really focus on common good based upon this definition. Your common good services are accessible to all and benefit to all in your community. They provide universal value. Essentially, these are services that contribute to your greater common good and can be characterized as essential or your must-haves, having community-wide interest and far-reaching impacts. Services contribute to greater equity and make everyone in Sandy's life better if they're common good services. Alternatively, your individualized services provide exclusive benefit to the individual or the groups using them and can include constraints or barriers to access for others. Essentially, these services benefit the individual more than the community as a whole, and they can be characterized as your discretionary services or your nice-to-haves with less of a community-wide impact. Individualized services can often be accessed from other providers in your community. So I want to also add, you'll notice on page 2, we've got a list of definitions. For those of you that are very literal, you like depth, you really want to understand a little bit more about what do you mean by access or barrier or need versus want or discretionary or essential. We've added some definitions on page 2 for you. What this helps with is taking a rather subjective exercise and making it a little bit more objective. What the ask is tonight is what you see on the bottom third of page 1. I'm going to ask you to rank the 10 department service categories, starting from the category that aligns most with the definition of common good being the number 1 category. So the service you believe aligns most with the definition of common good, you're going to put in the number 1 slot, to the service you believe is most individualized, that aligns most with the individualized definition above, will go on the number 10 slot. And then you're going to fill in the blanks in between. Now, I have 2 things I want to share with you. The first is simply a suggestion or recommendation. It's simply because of what we've heard and seen, what we've observed over the years of doing this work. And that is, you may want to approach this from what we call a bookends approach, meaning if it's easier for you, you might want to start with the number 1 service category, the one you think aligns most with common good, and then bounce down to 10 and say, okay, I think this one is most individualized, and you work your way towards the middle. If you're a linear thinker and doer, you may want to just go 1 to 10 or 10 to 1. It's entirely up to you, but it's just something I throw out there as a potential suggestion or recommendation for those of you that may want to do that. The second thing I'm going to share is actually a bit of and forgive the word choice here, it's a directive. Please, no self-talk about what you think things cost, how much you think you should charge. That is completely irrelevant to tonight's exercise. This is a beneficiary of service exercise. We will get to obviously the financial pieces of this as we move through the process, but tonight we're simply ranking your categories from common good to individual benefit. So please try to avoid self-talk around anything that has to do with money. We will get there, but not tonight. Okay, so any questions on the exercise and the ask before I share one more thing with you, and then I'm going to go ahead and give you a little bit of quiet time to do the exercise. But any questions from the group before we get started? Okay, I'm going to put the service categories on my screen, but let me just share with you what I have found to be a sweet spot for elected bodies and advisory groups is about 10 minutes to do this work. I'm going to give you 10 minutes. I'm going to take myself off a mic. And right now I have 27 minutes after the hour. I'm going to check in with you in about 10 minutes to see if you need any additional time. If you do, I absolutely will grant that. But that's, again, been a bit of a sweet spot to complete the exercise. So like I said, I'll check in with you at 37 after the hour. I've put the service categories back on my screen here if it helps you as a resource. And if I don't have any questions from anybody else, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to go ahead and begin.
Don has.
Maybe we have one question.
Yes.
Maybe it's the obvious one. How do you want us to send this to you or provide this? I missed something.
You haven't missed anything. You're going to share your responses with me and the entire group here after you're finished.
Got it.
We're going to do it on screen, Don. All right, everyone, I'll check back in with you in about 10.
It's not that difficult of an exercise.
Hey, I've been done for like 5 minutes. I almost keyed in and said, did I win?
Oh, I want to know my grade really bad.
You both won.
All right.
You both won. There are
Spoken
no
like a-
losers. There are no losers in this game.
Spoken like a true sports person right there. I like it.
All right, I think it's a perfect time to do a check-in. Does anyone require any additional time? All right, hearing none. Here's how this is going to work. So Don, your question is going to be answered here. So in this virtual setting, we've come up with a rather creative and kind of fun way to share your responses. So I'm going to ask you all to activate your cameras. I'm going to walk through the list of categories from top to bottom. We'll be starting with, of course, the first one listed, which is advanced competitive level classes and activities. And I'm just going to simply say, please share or please tell me in which position you placed that category. And by a show of hands and fingers, you're going to tell me which position you put that category in. So if I say, in which position did you place advanced competitive, and you put it in, let's say, the number 8 slot, you're going to show me 8 fingers. I'm going to ask you to
Lori,
what's that?
Lori, careful with the fingers. Careful.
Yeah, yeah, especially when we get to number 1. If it's easier for you to write your responses on a piece of paper, please feel free to do that. Staff are not going to be participating. This is simply for board and council. And I'm also going to ask you, once you put your vote up, if you will, your placement, please hold your hand up until I say okay and I move on to the next category. While this is being recorded, so we'll have a backup to support my collection of your responses. I just want to make sure that I'm able to capture all of your responses to each of the category placement rankings. Okay. So Kathleen and so I guess Jordan would be exempt here. And Chris, if you're going to participate, it'd be great if you kindly activate your cameras. And again, staff, please don't vote. So let's go ahead and start. And Chris, again, if you're on and you can hear me, if you'd activate your camera, that would be great. Oh, he's not participating. All right, perfect. Okay, so let's start with our first category, advanced competitive level classes and activities. In which position did you place that category? Please hold your hands up. Yeah, Lori, there you go. Pull them back a little bit so I can see them.
I can't count, so I'm using visual methods.
Heck, is that 8? Great, thank you. Kathleen, is that 6?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you. Next category, beginner intermediate level classes and activities. In which position did you place beginner intermediate level classes and activities? Great, thank you. Next category are your community events. In which position did you place community events? David, do you have a response for me? Great, thank you. All right, thanks everyone. Next category are your drop-in activities. In which position did you place drop-in activities? David? Yeah, David, if you wouldn't mind, just keep your hands up there until I move on to the next one. It's really helpful for me to make sure I've got everybody's responses. Okay, thank you. Your next category are your education and enrichment activities. In which position did you place education and enrichment? Okay, thank you. Next are your human services. In which position did you place human services? Great, thank you. Next is your open access category. In which position did you place open access? Great, thank you.
Good job, Laurie.
All right, next category, your rentals. In which position did you place rentals?
You all have too much stuff. I need to rent it, you guys.
Great, thank you. Next, social equity services. In which position did you place social equity services? Okay, thank you. And last but not least, in which position did you place special events? David?
David.
Count your fingers. Come on.
Thank
Come
you.
on, man.
All right. Okay. Great. Any thoughts you'd like to share? Reactions to that exercise?
My perception of the special events, having the mountain festival stuff underneath that special events, felt more like it should be under community events.
I lost count. I lost track of the numbers. I thought I was done.
I found that 1 and 2 and 8 and 9 were pretty easy for me to pick out. The rest, I could be talked into a lot of different places.
I agree.
Yeah.
That's what I found. The middle was hard.
Yep, that is always the case. The ends, the bookends are significantly easier than when you get towards the middle.
I feel like I don't totally understand the scope of each of these and the magnitude to which they reach the full community, because by helping some people, we're having kind of a trickle down or ripple effect of helping other people or the community as a whole, which may not look like, I guess, the most participation.
Yeah, good comments.
I think it's really different when you look at it from the availability of a service to be enjoyed by everybody as opposed to those who actually do take advantage of it or need it. So for me, the health services are potentially very important because I have parents in town who would utilize that. So, but it's available to everybody. It's still a benefit to the community. So for me, it's high, but I could see where others would put that low because, you know, it's targeting just a few, but it's open to everybody.
Yeah, yeah. And our, like it or not, our social values and our perspectives do kind of bleed into this exercise. And what's helpful are the definitions, obviously, for us to understand. We're talking about community-wide impact and access. Simply by virtue of the service being offered does not necessarily mean it's accessible to everyone. And there's a pretty strong delineation between access and availability. And so that's part of why, you know, we really need to think about access as part of this exercise. Again, we often say, well, it's there. People just need to use it. Well, many people may not find it accessible. There may be barriers to their participation.
To that end, I have to say that I changed my I think it was the social equity one, because my instinct was to put it further in the front, just because it seemed like if we're talking about access, that would be important. But then when you look at the definitions of who it impacts, it could be a smaller part of the community that actually need those social equity services. And so something about that feels mismatched somehow. But like it's a smaller group. And then maybe this is where what you were talking about comes in later, where we actually end up getting into the weeds of like how much things cost and what a goal of cost recovery actually is.
Right, right. And that's where there's a blending of, if you think about beneficiary, and I don't want to get too philosophical this evening, but you think about equity right now in our world. If we can assist and raise up certain populations, obviously an entire community is going to benefit. So that's why access has to be part of this conversation. It's not simply by virtue of that particular user is benefiting, but what does it mean to the greater community? What does it mean to the greater common good of the city of Sandy? And so that's why those definitions can be quite helpful. And when you start looking at constraints and barriers and essential versus discretionary and so on. So this is a place to begin. Right? This is the first time you're actually establishing this kind of foundation and this kind of baseline from which to work and think about these kinds of complex considerations and conversations, and ultimately at the end of the day, we are going to get to the place where the organization is going to make decisions about where does it want to put its taxpayer resources in order to have the greatest impact on the community. So this is a foundation from which you'll work.
It seems to me that that's our job, is to decide if we need to lower certain categories or raise certain categories based on the needs of the community, our perceived understanding of what our needs are, and maybe where our lack is, and maybe where our excesses are. So it seems to me that's some of the future decisions should be responsible to make.
Yeah, and your professional staff have had some very solid and deep discussions about things like need versus want. We often use frames in local government, community need, but we're not necessarily speaking about need. We're speaking about a demand or a desire or a want, in contrast to what are the community's needs today and our ability to influence those in some way by way of our taxpayer investment, right? By way of the services we provide. So this is all part of this exercise. We're sharing with you this evening, high level, why is it important to our world? What does this methodology look like? And then how can you all contribute as representative community members, along with your professional content matter experts, your professional staff, to creating this first iteration of your strategy. It will not be static. Nothing about the economy is static today. Nothing about your financial sustainability strategy will be static as you move forward. You're going to constantly be reviewing it and analyzing it, what makes the most sense based upon the dynamic changes in your community, as well as the dynamic changes of your financial condition as an organization, as well as the community. So, I applaud any organization for jumping into this right now. You're setting a baseline. That's what you're doing, but it will not be a static exercise. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen one more time. I just want to close with some next steps, and then Rochelle, I'm going to defer to you for final thoughts. So this is where we're headed. Your contributions tonight, again, incredibly valuable to what this first iteration of the strategy will look like. Next steps, very simply, we'll be synthesizing the results of your work this evening, along with what we heard from the staff. The staff went through the very same exercise you did. And then we'll be designing beneficiary service model drafts for Rochelle and the project team's review. We're going to have a staff model. We'll have a board, a council model, and then we'll have a hybrid. So we'll take into consideration what we heard from the staff, what we heard from all of you this evening, and create a hybrid model that will be shared with Rochelle and her team. The cost of service work continues behind the scenes. We're getting close to the finish line with that, but that continues. Once we have the cost of service analysis completed, we schedule what we call a reveal and a goal setting meeting with the project team of the organization. We share all of the insights. We share the tool that we use. Rochelle's familiar with this. And then we'll share a series of guiding principles so that goal setting is not done in an arbitrary fashion. We'll be looking at their current performance, current cost recovery performance. You'll be looking at your budget projections for next year and your fiscal realities, essentially, to determine what goals make the most sense for the organization for the foreseeable future. We usually recommend no more than a 2 to 3 year strategy continuum. And then we'll complete the continuum with the goals. And then we've got a next step in this process, which will include policy development. And we'll be working with the project team to determine, what kind of policies would they like to see created. The three most common that we see are a financial sustainability policy, a capital investment policy, and a social equity policy. But those are just the more typical ones we're seeing today on behalf of Park and Rec Systems. But we'll work with Rochelle and the team to determine what she thinks is best and in the best interest of the organization and the community moving forward. So Rochelle, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I just wanted to say thanks one more time for everybody's time and attention tonight. And just to let the group know that, like Jamie had talked about, the department's going to continue to work with Jamie on, working through the unveil of the budget. We're going to look at the cost recovery model, and then we'll start working on policy creation that will incorporate the cost recovery model. And this will be something that the council will hopefully take a look at and review and provide input and eventually approval. That will be our guiding North Star as we look at setting budget parameters and different things as we move forward. And again, as a department, this is going to be really, really important for us because it helps us set goals when we want to accomplish, or if we're looking at a new program or event. We've got parameters to work within. And so this is a really important part to go through. And I do sincerely appreciate your time and your buy-in and taking a look at this work with us. And so, yeah, along with that, we'll also be looking at, we won't do this in a vacuum. We'll be talking about communication plans and implementation plans and doing things in an incremental way that would be palatable to the community. And so we'll be very mindful as we move through this process, very mindful. But strategically, this will really help with the future of the department as we move through with being more sustainable. So that is all I have.
Cool. Well, thank you everyone for participating tonight. Thank you, Jamie, for leading us through this, and Rochelle and all of our team members at the city for participating and helping put this together as well. I agree with everything both Jamie and Rochelle said. I think this is going to be really beneficial for our community. And as you think through all of these different events, the better cost recovery model we come up with, the more recreational opportunities we're going to be able to provide for members of our community. And that's the end goal. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And thanks for giving us a part of it. See you guys.
Great job. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.